It was the kind of autumn evening that made the skin prickle, with the dying sun casting an eerie amber glow over the small town of Carrion Hollow. The wind whistled through the half-bare trees, sending dry leaves skittering across the cracked pavement like restless spirits. The air had the unmistakable bite of impending winter, but tonight, something far colder, far more ancient, was stirring beneath the surface. The townsfolk, unaware of the malevolent force creeping into their lives, were buzzing with anticipation. For the first time in the town's long, uneventful history, a special election had been scheduled on Halloween night. The news had come suddenly, as if out of nowhere, a peculiar decree that felt both urgent and inevitable. No one questioned why, they simply complied. After all, Carrion Hollow had always been a place where traditions, no matter how strange, were followed without hesitation. As the shadows lengthened, a group of young men and women gathered near the old town square. Among them was Ethan Marsh, a tall, quiet man with the kind of calm demeanor that hid a deep curiosity. He had never been one to indulge in superstition, but there was something about this election, this night, that gnawed at him. It wasn't just the oddity of voting on Halloween, it was the sense that something far darker was at play. "Do you think this is just some stunt?" asked one of Ethan's friends, a lanky young man named Kyle, his voice dripping with nervous energy. "Why on Halloween of all nights? It feels off." Ethan glanced at the large, looming town hall where the voting was to take place. It sat at the center of Carrion Hollow like a watchful guardian, its Gothic architecture casting jagged, menacing shadows. For decades, the building had been the heart of the town's local government, but tonight, it felt like something far more sinister, a relic of forgotten horrors. "I don't know," Ethan muttered, his gaze fixed on the building. "But there's something strange about all of this. The election, the timing, it feels like it was meant to be tonight. Like we're being drawn here." As they spoke, the crowd around the town square grew larger. People were arriving in droves, their faces obscured by the dim light of dusk, moving in a silent procession toward the polling station. Some carried jack-o'-lanterns, their grinning faces flickering with candlelight. Others wore masks, their laughter hollow and forced, as though some invisible hand compelled them to take part in this macabre spectacle. Ethan's unease deepened as he watched the townspeople shuffle forward. He noticed something strange. Many of the faces in the crowd seemed unfamiliar, even though Carrion Hollow was a small town where everyone knew each other. It was as though some of these figures had emerged from the shadows themselves, drawn from places unknown, only to vanish back into the darkness once their role in the night's events was complete. "I don't like this," said Emma, another one of Ethan's friends, her voice trembling. "It feels like we're part of some kind of ritual. Doesn't anyone else feel it? The air, it's heavy, like something is watching us." Kyle scoffed, but Ethan could see the fear behind his bravado. "Come on, Emma, you're letting Halloween get to you. It's just an election. We'll vote, go home, and laugh about this tomorrow." But Ethan wasn't so sure. There was an ancient pull in the air, something older than the town itself, lurking just beneath the surface of this seemingly innocent civic duty. He glanced around at the buildings surrounding the square, at the windows darkened and shuttered, as though the town had turned its back on them. It was as if they were alone in some forgotten pocket of time, disconnected from the rest of the world. As they made their way toward the entrance of the town hall, Ethan's eyes caught something, an inscription carved into the stone archway above the doors. It was worn and weathered, almost invisible in the fading light, but the words, once he squinted to see them, sent a chill down his spine. "In somno veritas." In sleep, truth. Ethan felt a deep sense of dread wash over him as he stood before the threshold. It wasn't just an election. It wasn't just Halloween. It was something far older, far darker than he could ever have imagined. And it was already too late to turn back. As Ethan and his friends stepped into the dimly lit town hall, the air grew colder, as if the very walls exhaled an ancient breath. The grand entrance hall stretched before them, long and shadowy, its stone pillars towering like silent sentinels. Flickering lanterns cast feeble light along the polished marble floor, but the darkness clung to every corner, every crevice, as though it had taken on a life of its own. In the center of the hall stood the voting booths, rows of curtained alcoves lined up with unnatural precision. Beyond them, the town clerk sat at a heavy wooden table, his hollow eyes glancing over the growing crowd with a strange, knowing gaze. His thin lips curved in a smile that felt more like a grimace, as if he were privy to some unspeakable secret. Ethan's unease only deepened. He glanced over his shoulder at Emma and Kyle, who stood behind him, their faces pale in the lantern light. A sense of wrongness permeated the room, a palpable tension that seemed to hum in the very air, like the distant thrum of an ancient, unseen machine. "Come on," Kyle muttered, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "Let's just get this over with." They moved toward the clerk, who silently handed each of them a ballot, his bony fingers brushing against Ethan's hand with an icy touch. As Ethan looked at the slip of paper, his brow furrowed. There were only 2 names listed, neither of which he recognized. Jacob Crowder and Elias Bourne. Both names felt foreign, as if they belonged to a time long forgotten, yet their presence on the ballot seemed inevitable, as though these figures had always lurked just beneath the surface of Carrion Hollow's history. Ethan hesitated. The ink on the paper seemed to swirl slightly, as though alive, pulsing with a rhythm that resonated with something deep within him. His mind felt fogged, his thoughts sluggish, as if the very act of casting his vote would bind him to something far greater, far darker than the simple civic duty it pretended to be. He glanced around, hoping to see the same confusion reflected in his friends' faces, but they had already disappeared into their voting booths, the curtains drawn behind them like the final act of a grim play. With a deep breath, Ethan approached his own booth. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the stench of damp earth and something else, something far older, like the scent of time itself decaying. The paper ballot trembled slightly in his hand, and as he reached for the pen, his fingers brushed against the cold metal, and the world seemed to shift. Suddenly, the walls of the booth began to distort. The shadows stretched and warped, as if reality itself was fraying at the edges. Ethan blinked, his heart pounding in his chest, but when his eyes opened again, the booth had vanished. He was no longer in the town hall. Instead, he stood at the edge of a vast, desolate landscape, a barren wasteland of cracked earth and skeletal trees stretching endlessly beneath a sky of swirling, blood-red clouds. The air was thick with ash, and the ground trembled beneath his feet, as though some monstrous force slumbered just beneath the surface. In the distance, dark figures moved, silent, faceless shapes that drifted across the landscape like ghosts, their forms flickering and fading with each step. And above them all, towering over the horizon, loomed a structure, a vast, cyclopean edifice of impossible geometry, its black stone glistening with the sheen of something alive. It pulsed with a deep, rhythmic vibration, a soundless hum that resonated in Ethan's bones, in his very soul. Before he could fully comprehend the nightmare unfolding before him, a voice echoed in the distance, low, guttural, and filled with a malevolent glee. Insomno veritas. The phrase carved above the town hall door echoed in his mind. In sleep, truth. But what truth? What madness had he stumbled into? His thoughts were a blur, but instinct drove him to flee, to escape the suffocating presence of the alien landscape before him. Yet no matter which direction he turned, the figures in the distance closed in, their movements growing faster, more deliberate. He stumbled backward, his breath ragged, and as he fell to the ground, his vision blurred. The last thing he saw before the darkness overtook him was a pair of glowing eyes, cold, ancient, filled with knowledge no human mind was meant to comprehend. When Ethan blinked again, he was back in the voting booth, the pen still clutched in his trembling hand. The ballot lay before him, untouched, but his heart raced, his mind reeling from the vision, or had it been more than a vision? He stumbled out of the booth, nearly colliding with Emma and Kyle, who were waiting near the exit. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with a silent terror that mirrored his own. "Did you?" Emma began, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head, unable to find words. They were no longer in control. Whatever had begun here tonight was far beyond their understanding, far beyond the simple act of casting a vote. Something had awakened, something old and hungry, and it was using this election, this night of Halloween, to reach into their world. The doors to the town hall creaked open behind them, and one by one, the townspeople emerged. But they were different now, their eyes empty, their faces blank. They moved like puppets, drawn by invisible strings toward the square outside, where the darkened streets awaited. And in the air, Ethan could still hear the faint whisper of that ancient voice, calling to him, beckoning him deeper into the nightmare that had only just begun. The moon had risen high above Carrion Hollow, a sickly, pallid orb that hung in the sky like a watchful eye, bathing the town in a cold, spectral light. As Ethan, Emma, and Kyle emerged from the town hall, the oppressive weight of the night settled on their shoulders. The streets were empty now, save for the silent figures of the townspeople, who drifted toward the center of the square in a slow, somnambulistic procession. The sound of their footsteps on the cobblestone streets was hollow, as though the very ground beneath them had grown thin, fragile, like a veil over something terrible and unseen. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The vision, or whatever it had been, in the voting booth still clawed at his thoughts. The image of that alien landscape seared into his brain. The words in Somno Veritas echoed in his skull, carrying with them a sense of dread he could not shake. He glanced at his friends, but their faces mirrored his own terror. They had seen something too, felt something, but none of them dared speak of it yet. The town itself seemed to be listening. The three of them moved instinctively toward the square, drawn by the same unseen force that propelled the townspeople. The shadows stretched long and dark across the pavement, and the buildings loomed high above, their Gothic facades twisting in the moonlight, as if the very architecture of Carrion Hollow had become malevolent, warping to reflect the sinister presence that now gripped the town. "What's happening?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't just a coincidence, is it? The election, the date, it's all connected." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the crowd ahead. "No, it's not a coincidence. Something wanted this election to happen tonight. Something ancient." Kyle, usually the skeptic, said nothing. His bravado had evaporated, and in its place was a silence born of pure, unadulterated fear. Whatever this force was, it was far beyond anything they could have anticipated, and its presence was growing stronger with every passing moment. As they reached the edge of the square, Ethan noticed something strange, a low hum, barely audible, vibrating through the air. It was the same sound he had heard in his vision, the same deep, primal frequency that seemed to pulse from beneath the earth itself. He scanned the faces of the townspeople, but their expressions were vacant, their eyes glazed over as they gathered in the center of the square, circling the old fountain like moths drawn to a flame. And then he saw it, at the heart of the square, atop the fountain, was a strange object, something that hadn't been there before. It was a stone obelisk, weathered and ancient, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to writhe and twist in the moonlight. The symbols were unfamiliar, yet they stirred something in the deepest recesses of Ethan's mind, something primal and terrifying, as though his very soul recoiled at the sight of them. The obelisk hummed with the same vibration he had felt in his bones, and as the townspeople gathered around it, their bodies began to move in unison, swaying gently as though caught in the rhythm of an unseen force. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out, at least, none that Ethan could hear. But the air was thick with a strange, alien energy, and the words they spoke seemed to vibrate through the fabric of reality itself. "We need to leave," Kyle muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum. This is wrong. We shouldn't be here." But Ethan couldn't move. His eyes were locked on the obelisk, and as he stared at the carvings, he realized with a sickening certainty that they were not merely symbols, they were letters, ancient and twisted, spelling out a name that had not been spoken in millennia. Vorn. The name from the ballot. The name that had meant nothing to him before, but now carried with it the weight of something unspeakable, something beyond human comprehension. Elias Vorn was no mere candidate in an election. He was something far older, something that had existed long before the town of Carrion Hollow had been founded, long before human civilization itself had taken root. And now, on this night of Halloween, the night when the veil between worlds was thinnest, he had returned. A cold, paralyzing fear gripped Ethan's heart as the truth dawned on him. The election wasn't about choosing a mayor or a councilman. It wasn't about politics at all. It was a ritual, a summoning, designed to bring forth an ancient entity from the depths of time and space. The townspeople, unwitting pawns in this cosmic game, had been manipulated, their fears and desires twisted to fuel the return of Vorn, the Eternal One, the Devourer of Worlds. Ethan stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned to Emma and Kyle, but before he could speak, a sound erupted from the obelisk, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The ground beneath their feet trembled violently, and cracks began to spiderweb across the cobblestones. The townspeople, still locked in their trance, began to convulse, their bodies twitching unnaturally as the hum from the obelisk grew louder, more insistent. And then, with a sickening crack, the fountain split open, revealing a dark, gaping hole beneath it, a void that seemed to stretch into infinity, a portal to some otherworldly realm. From the depths of the void came a figure, a towering, shadowy form that defied explanation. Its shape was amorphous, shifting and writhing like smoke, yet there was an unmistakable intelligence behind it, an ancient malevolence that radiated from it like a physical force. Its eyes, glowing, fiery orbs, locked onto Ethan, and in that moment, he felt the weight of 1,000 forgotten worlds pressing down upon him, the unbearable knowledge of things no human mind was meant to know. Vorn, Ethan whispered, the name escaping his lips like a curse. The figure shifted, its massive form blotting out the moonlight as it rose from the void. The townspeople, still chanting in their silent, alien tongue, fell to their knees, their faces contorted in expressions of rapture and horror. Ethan could feel the pull of the void now, a gravitational force tugging at the edges of his consciousness, threatening to drag him down into the depths of madness. He knew they had to escape, had to get as far away from Carrion Hollow as possible, but how could they outrun something that had already infiltrated their very souls? "We have to go," Emma's voice cut through the haze of terror, her hand gripping Ethan's arm with a desperate strength. But as they turned to flee, the ground beneath them buckled, and the last vestiges of normalcy in Carrion Hollow crumbled into chaos. The earth itself seemed to groan in agony as the abyss yawned wider, swallowing the fountain and the square around it. Ethan, Emma, and Kyle stumbled backward, their breaths ragged and panicked as they struggled to keep their footing. The swirling shadows of the entity, Vorn, blotted out the sky, casting the entire town into a thick, suffocating darkness. The air was alive with the sound of chanting, the guttural, incomprehensible words of the townspeople, now nothing more than thralls to the ancient force they had unwittingly summoned. Ethan's mind raced, his thoughts clouded by the sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing. How could something so ancient, so vast, have been lying dormant beneath Carrion Hollow all this time? And how had the election, so mundane, so human, become the conduit for its return? The questions swirled in his head, but deep down, he knew the answers would only drive him further into madness. This was no longer about understanding. It was about survival. "We have to get out of here," Emma screamed, her voice barely audible over the deafening hum that now seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath them. Kyle, still reeling from the shock, grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him toward the edge of the square. "Ethan, move! We need to get to the woods, away from this thing." But Ethan's feet felt like lead. His eyes were drawn inexorably to the void, to the churning shadows that seemed to pulse and writhe with some malevolent, otherworldly intelligence. The figure of Vorn was now fully formed, a colossal mass of darkness, barely humanoid in shape, its tendrils reaching out toward the sky like the limbs of some ancient, forgotten god. It was as though the entity were pulling the very fabric of reality apart, warping the world around it with its mere presence. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, Ethan felt something, a pull, not from the void, but from deep within his own mind. The words from the ballad, in Somno Veritas, whispered again, not in his ears, but in the recesses of his consciousness. "The truth lies in dreams." What could it mean? Was this all a nightmare, a grotesque hallucination? Or was there some deeper, darker truth lurking beneath the surface of reality itself? With a sudden surge of clarity, Ethan tore his gaze away from the void and turned to his friends. "We need to get to the old church," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The basement, there's something there. I don't know how I know, but it's the only way." "The church?" Emma looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Ethan, what are you talking about? What's in the church?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his voice shaky, "but it's the only place that feels safe. There's something about it. We need to go, now." Without waiting for a response, Ethan bolted toward the narrow street that led to the outskirts of town. Emma and Kyle hesitated for only a moment before following, the sound of their footsteps barely audible over the growing roar of the void behind them. As they ran, the ground beneath them continued to tremble, cracks spiderwebbing across the cobblestones and buildings, as though the town itself were being torn apart by the presence of the ancient entity. The church loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette in the moonlight, its spire reaching toward the sky like a finger pointing to some unseen horror beyond the stars. It was an old building, older than any other in Carrion Hollow, and for as long as Ethan could remember, it had always seemed out of place in the town, its Gothic architecture at odds with the more modest structures that surrounded it. As they reached the church, Ethan could feel the oppressive weight of the night pressing down on him, the darkness thick and suffocating. The doors were ajar, creaking ominously as they pushed their way inside. The interior of the church was bathed in shadow, the faint glow of the moon filtering through the stained glass windows, casting twisted, distorted shapes on the walls. The air was cold, and the smell of damp stone and decay filled their nostrils. "This place gives me the creeps," Kyle muttered, his voice barely above a whisper as they made their way down the aisle. "Are you sure this is where we need to be?" Ethan nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. The pull in his mind, the strange sense of familiarity, was stronger now, as though something deep within the church was calling to him. And then he saw it, an old, rusted door at the far end of the sanctuary, partially hidden behind the altar. It led down into the depths of the building. "The basement," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "Whatever's happening, it started down there." With a sense of dread settling over them, they descended the narrow stone staircase, the walls closing in around them as they ventured deeper into the bowels of the church. The air grew colder, and the distant hum that had pervaded the town seemed to grow louder with every step, vibrating through the very stones beneath their feet. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with old, crumbling bookshelves, and in the center of the room was a large stone altar, covered in strange symbols and markings that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering candlelight. But it wasn't the altar that held their attention, it was the object that sat atop it. A small, black box, made of some material Ethan couldn't identify, sat on the altar, its surface covered in the same ancient symbols they had seen on the obelisk. The box seemed to hum with a faint, malevolent energy, and as Ethan approached it, he could feel the pull in his mind growing stronger, as though the box itself were calling to him. This is it," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is what's been controlling everything." As his hand hovered over the box, the ground beneath them trembled again, and the distant roar of the void grew louder. They had found the source, but they had no idea what would happen if they opened it. The chamber's oppressive air thickened, as though the very atmosphere recoiled from the presence of the box atop the altar. The dim candlelight flickered, casting monstrous, distorted shadows on the walls that seemed to move of their own accord. Ethan, Emma, and Kyle stood frozen, their breaths shallow and strained, eyes locked on the black box, which pulsed with an unnatural energy. A low, vibrating hum emanated from it, echoing the dark, cosmic cadence of something vast and incomprehensible stirring beneath the fabric of reality. Ethan's hand trembled as it hovered just inches from the box. He could feel its pull, an irresistible gravity not just on his body, but on his very mind. Something inside it was alive, something ancient and terrible, bound by the intricate, arcane symbols etched into its surface. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to flee, but the words, in somno veritas, echoed in his thoughts. The truth lies in dreams. Could this box hold the answer to the horrors that had befallen Carrion Hollow? "We can't." Emma's voice was barely a whisper, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. "We have to destroy it. We can't let whatever's inside out." Kyle stepped back, his body rigid with fear. "This place, this thing, it's like something from a nightmare." "Ethan, don't touch it. We need to get out of here." But Ethan, entranced by the unseen force within the box, ignored them. His fingers grazed the cold, unnatural surface, and for a brief moment, the hum of the box ceased. Silence. A deafening silence that stretched across the boundaries of time and space, as if the entire universe had paused, waiting for his next move. Then, without warning, the symbols on the box flared to life, glowing with a sickly, pulsating light. Ethan felt the weight of 1,000 alien eyes upon him, probing, searching, reaching through the veil of his thoughts. It was as though the box itself were sentient, a relic not of human creation, but of something far older, something that predated mankind and its feeble understanding of the cosmos. The hum returned, louder now, almost a deafening roar, as the box began to vibrate violently under his touch. Ethan jerked his hand away, stumbling backward. But it was too late. The box began to open. A thin crack appeared at its center, and from within, a thick, inky blackness oozed out, swirling like smoke, but heavier, denser, alive. The dark tendrils writhed through the air, spreading like a malignant force, consuming the light, the walls, the air itself. It was no mere darkness, but something far more primal, a void, a tear in the very fabric of existence. The blackness pulled on the floor, expanding outward, and with it came a cacophony of voices, low, guttural whispers, unintelligible yet filled with malice. Ethan staggered back, his mind reeling as the voices invaded his thoughts, scratching at the edges of his sanity. "You have seen what was never meant for mortal eyes." The words echoed in his skull, not spoken, but felt, as though they had always been there, lurking in the recesses of his mind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, each one peeling away another layer of reality, exposing the raw, pulsating truth beneath. Ethan clutched his head, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The truth was inescapable. The box had been a seal, a prison. And now it was broken. Emma screamed, the sound piercing through the oppressive din. The darkness had reached the walls of the chamber, and as it touched the stone, the very fabric of the building seemed to dissolve, crumbling into dust. The floor beneath them trembled, threatening to collapse under the weight of the void. "We have to go," Kyle shouted, grabbing Ethan by the arm and dragging him toward the stairs. "Now." But as they turned to flee, the darkness surged forward, tendrils of black smoke wrapping around their legs, pulling them down. Ethan felt the cold, suffocating grip of the void dragging him toward the abyss, the voices growing louder, more insistent. "Do not run from the truth, for it has always been with you. In the deepest corners of your soul." Ethan's mind spiraled into chaos. Visions flashed before his eyes, visions of Carrion Hollow, but twisted, distorted, as though viewed through a cracked mirror. The townspeople, their faces blank and expressionless, marched in endless lines toward the square, toward the obelisk, their bodies consumed by the same swirling darkness. And in the center of it all, Vorn, its massive, shadowy form towering over them, its tendrils reaching into their very souls. This election had never been about politics. It was a ritual, a summoning. And they were all the unwitting participants in an ancient, cosmic game played by forces far beyond their understanding. The darkness tightened its grip, pulling Ethan deeper into the void. His vision blurred, the world around him fading into black. But just before the darkness consumed him completely, he felt a sudden jolt, a spark of light in the overwhelming shadow. The church bell. It rang out through the night, clear and sharp, cutting through the cacophony of voices. The darkness recoiled, its tendrils loosening their grip, and for the briefest of moments, Ethan could see again. The bell rang again, louder this time, the sound reverberating through the chamber like a clarion call, driving back the void. Emma, still clutching the rope of the bell tower, shouted down to them, her voice filled with desperation. "Come on! We have to move!" With one final, desperate surge of energy, Ethan broke free of the tendrils and staggered toward the stairs. Kyle followed close behind, his face pale with terror. Together, they scrambled up the staircase, the darkness nipping at their heels. As they burst through the doors of the church, they were met with the cold night air. But the town was no longer recognizable. The square, the buildings, everything was swallowed by the void, now spreading through Carrion Hollow like a plague. The blackness reached out across the streets, consuming everything in its path, leaving nothing but a yawning abyss in its wake. "We need to get to higher ground," Ethan gasped, his legs trembling beneath him. But even as they ran, he knew deep down that there was no escape. Whatever ancient evil they had unleashed, it was beyond human comprehension, and it was coming for them. As the trio raced through the collapsing streets of Carrion Hollow, the earth beneath their feet trembled with each violent pulse of the encroaching darkness. The stars above, once clear and watchful, had dimmed into a swirling chaos of unnatural hues, impossible, twisting colors that no human eye should behold. The very sky seemed to tear apart, revealing glimpses of a monstrous void beyond, a cosmic realm of madness where time and space were but fragile illusions. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he led the way, Emma and Kyle close behind. The void was everywhere now, devouring the town, the land, the air itself, pulling them inexorably toward its black maw. As they reached the town's highest hill, Ethan turned and looked down upon what had once been Carrion Hollow. In its place was a vast, writhing sea of darkness, broken only by the jagged silhouette of the obelisk, which now seemed to throb with the same malevolent energy that surged through the box. It's too late, Ethan thought, his mind reeling. There's no stopping it. There never was. Emma clutched his arm, her voice trembling. Ethan, what do we do? How do we stop this? He looked at her, hollow-eyed, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. We don't. It's beyond us. Beyond anything we can understand. But even as he spoke, a terrible realization dawned upon him. The box, the relic, had been a prison for something far more ancient than the obelisk, something that the town had long forgotten, but which had remained buried beneath the veneer of their quiet lives. The election, the strange timing, the unnatural occurrences, it had all been orchestrated, not by men, but by the influence of an alien will older than time itself. The veil between worlds had been torn open, and through that tear, the thing from beyond had returned. Vorn, the name echoed in Ethan's mind like a forbidden whisper, a being not of this world, but of the spaces between, where the laws of the cosmos were but fragile dreams. Vorn was not a creature bound by flesh or form, but an embodiment of fear itself, feeding on the collective horrors of humankind, growing stronger with each terrified breath. The obelisk, now fully revealed, began to glow with a sickening, pulsating light. From its surface, grotesque shapes emerged, slithering, shifting entities that defied the laws of nature, their forms constantly in flux. These were not creatures born of this earth, but the nightmares of an ancient race that had long since perished, leaving behind only their dread. Kyle gasped in horror as one of the writhing shapes detached itself from the obelisk, a mass of undulating darkness that moved with purpose. What is that? It is the Harbinger, Ethan realized, his stomach churning with the knowledge that had been forced into his mind by the box. A servant of Vorn, here to usher in its return. The thing slithered forward, its body stretching and coiling like smoke, yet solid and tactile. It moved toward them with a terrifying inevitability, as if it were a manifestation of death itself, come to claim what was owed. We can't let it reach us. Emma cried, backing away. But Ethan knew the truth, there was no escape. This thing, this entity from beyond the stars, had already claimed them the moment they had stepped foot in the chapel. Their fate had been sealed from the start. The Harbinger loomed closer, and as it did, the air around it seemed to warp and twist, the very fabric of reality bending to its will. A strange, maddening sound filled the air, a keening wail that burrowed deep into their minds, shattering any last vestige of hope. Emma clutched her head, collapsing to the ground, while Kyle stood frozen in place, his mouth agape, eyes wide with unspeakable terror. We are but insects, Ethan thought, his vision blurring as the dark tendrils reached for him. Insects in a universe that has no care for our existence. Vorn is not evil. It is simply beyond understanding, beyond reason. As the Harbinger's tendrils wrapped around him, pulling him toward the growing void, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace. The terror, though still present, had become something distant, something abstract. His mind, his very essence, was being unraveled, dissolved into the greater darkness that awaited them all. The stars above twisted in their death throes, the last remnants of the sky collapsing into the abyss. And as Ethan's consciousness slipped away, consumed by the infinite blackness, he saw it, a glimpse of the true cosmos, vast and uncaring. In that brief moment, he understood. Humanity was but a fleeting thought in the endless expanse of time, a flicker of light soon to be extinguished by the forces that lurked in the void. As Carrion Hollow was swallowed by the darkness, the last echoes of the church bell faded into silence. The town, the people, the election, they were all gone, erased from existence, leaving nothing but a hollow memory in the endless night. And in the center of that void, Vorn stirred once more. Thus ended the tale of Carrion Hollow, a town forgotten by history, erased by the forces that exist beyond the understanding of man. The truth, if it had ever existed, was lost in the whispers of the void, and the universe, indifferent and vast, carried on its ancient, unknowable horrors, watching from the depths of space and time, waiting for the next veil to tear. For in the end, it was not the election that mattered, but the return of that which had always been waiting. And as the last trace of light disappeared, only the void remained eternal, and the silence of the stars whispered of things too terrible to name.